Do you place that as your highest likelihood hypothesis, that there is some kind of singular breakaway civilization that is the source of all of this wisdom?
Yes, in a way. When you say a breakaway civilization, I think, we can definitely speak of fingerprints. The fingerprints are all over the place, right?
Yeah.
But who left those fingerprints? If we want to use a metaphor, let's call it a sacred machine. And we'll speculate that once upon a time, there was a civilization that could have arisen using sources of energy, tapping into sources of energy which we've forgotten about. We have to first of all understand that what they're doing is about merging the sacred and the mundane.
Right.
And I believe that what they were doing was understanding this integration of the greater and the lesser, that they had a sort of a fractal concept of reality.
Randall Carlson, despite the fact that you have not been on this show in well over 400 episodes at this point, I often think of you as one of the ideal potential guests for this show, because I think you overlap with so many core through lines and the entire ethos of this show. So I'm just so excited to riff with you on a multitude of topics, man.
Well, I love talking about a multitude of topics. It does keep the conversation interesting.
Yeah.
Although sometimes I like to just dive in, really deep, not go too horizontal, but just dive in deep to pick one topic and just see how far you can go with it. And
yeah,
but I like it both ways.
I get that complaint a lot, man, about not going deep enough. Like
you do.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we might have to do a follow-up interview, and I think
I meant that as a joke, to be honest, but also it's probably also true.
Oh, okay. Well, once I get better at understanding your sense of humor, I will get your jokes and be able to laugh along. Just cut me a little slack if your jokes go over my head initially.
Hey,
okay.
if you just default to like grade school humor, you got it.
Hey,
but
that's easy for me, let me tell you.
One of the things I have wanted to explore with more depth, honestly, on the show is the sort of ancient civilization and megalithic structure, and this sort of what I think is a hidden, lost language of potentially, what you've called the breakaway civilization, what people like Richard Dolan have called the breakaway civilization. But before we go there, just this question of these ancient megalithic sites in general. You are so knowledgeable on this topic, again, from a multitude of angles, that I think a lot of people don't think about very often. There's a lot of people who like to think of them according to one potential narrative, but you look at everything from the potential construction abilities to the weathering to the sacred geometry. You speculate to some degree about what the function of these sites might have been, what this civilization might have been that built these sites, or what they may have had in common. So there's so much to approach when even beginning to talk about this. But let's just start with an obvious one. When you look at something like the Great Pyramid, let's say, with all of the multitude of theories of stuff that's out there, what do you think that thing is?
Well, first of all, you got to, when you look at the pyramids, if you're in at the time that they were part of a functioning civilization, or whoever that antecedent civilization might have been that built those pyramids, you got to picture what they looked like in their pristine condition.
Yeah.
What we're seeing now is just the ruin in a sense. But at one time, particularly, like, let's just talk about Khufu's pyramid, it was sheathed in highly polished white limestone with extremely tight joinery between the individual blocks. It would have been a sight to behold if you're coming across the desert, but it maybe was not even a desert at the time. You see this thing off in the distance, this great white pyramid. It would have been an impressive sight. No doubt about it. But there's so much to unpack there. First of all, put it in the context of the times. Okay, so Zosier's pyramid had supposedly, I believe, in the conventional chronologies, been the first pyramid. Khufu's followed maybe a couple of generations later. I don't know. I don't have the numbers exact in my head, but it's generally Khufu's pyramid was post Zosier's pyramid, and Zosier's pyramid was, I guess, the first prototype, right? At least according to some theories. But here's the thing that gets me. You know, we were talking before the show. I grew
Mm-hmm.
up in a rural environment. Most of our neighbors, in fact, pretty much all of our neighbors were farmers. So there was a lot of. I grew up. We weren't farmers. My dad was a carpenter builder, but I grew up on farms because we knew our neighbors. I had a nearest neighbor, one of our, not the nearest farm, but it was a farm that the youngest boy of the 10 kids on the farm was the same age as me. So once we moved to this, I told you before the show, we bought this piece of rural land. It was
Mm-hmm.
sitting on a lake, um, adjacent to a lake called Schmidt Lake. And our address was 4610 Schmidt Crossroad. And our nearer neighbors on both sides were the two Schmidt brothers who had farms. And we bought our property from Carl Schmidt. But anyways, the point is it was all farms, right? So I grew up around farms. I spent as much time like at our neighbors or hanging out with my friend on his farm. So it was like farms were like a second home to me. Okay, so I had that, I guess you'd just say, immersion into agricultural life, and got familiar with the essentially growing up with the rhythms, because when you're a farmer, you're very much embedded in the rhythms of the season,
Yeah.
and you have cycles, and you have certain things you do at certain seasons, and then typically in Minnesota, you have this block in there where for about 3 months, 4 months, you're not doing a whole lot. You know,
Right.
you're still feeding the stock, you're feeding your animals, but all of that all of that food has been brought in during the fall. You know, you're not doing that. So in other words, you're out there, you're planting in the spring, you're harvesting in the fall, and then you're sustaining. But in there, in a lifestyle like that, why would you? Here's the question: if you're in an agricultural, the whole society
Yeah.
is essentially subsistence agriculture. What's going to be your motive to, to quarry, what is it, 2.3 million blocks
Yeah.
and build something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a disconnect there that I've never been able to fathom.
Yeah.
Why would you do this? Well, okay, but let's cast our net beyond Egypt. Let's look all over the world, and we
Yeah.
find examples of megalithic structures. Now, you know, I did most of my. I'm not building as much like I used to. I'm semi-retired in that respect, but you know, I built a lot of stuff over 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
I never had to handle. Usually, the biggest weight we would sometimes have to handle might be a ton. I don't know if we ever exceeded that, but a ton, it might be a 24-foot I-beam, right? We got to get it up into place. So we had ways. There were ways we had learned. You know, how do you lift up a 24-foot I-beam? Well,
Yeah.
you pry up one side and you put a block under it, and you have a pivot under it just the right size, and then essentially you walk it up, right? And then you have to move it laterally to get it into place. Now, so we could do that, you know, by hand. Now, if we'd gotten bigger than that, which maybe on occasion we did, but you know, we weren't building high rises, large commercial or industrial buildings. We were mostly building residential. But there was a few occasions where we'd actually get a crane to come in and set something for us, right? We are not talking. I mean, if we got up to 2 tons, yeah, we're calling the crane. So my point is, though, we look at the megalithic structures around the world, and you're seeing stones, thousands and thousands of stones in the 1 to 5 ton range. You're seeing stones that are 10 tons, 20 tons, in some cases up to like 100 tons in exceptional circumstances. Now, we're seeing this where? Not just Egypt, but we're seeing it in South America. You know, we're seeing it Malta. We're seeing it in Lebanon. We're seeing movement of huge stones in Northern Europe, in the British Isles. Now we're finding out about megalithic remains in Russia. So, I mean, you know, I guess what I'm getting at here is there was a lot of cultures in the ancient world who, for whatever reason, were quarrying and moving really big stones
Yeah.
and building things out of them. Now, we build, today, in the 19th century, a lot of architecture, was still stonework. Now, most stonework on building is just going to be veneer stone, and it might be real stone, but it's essentially 2 to 3 inches thick. It's mortared on, and you can't tell. I mean, it might look like it's real 3D solid stones, but it's just a veneer.
Mm-hmm.
Why did we go to a veneer? Well, because it's more economical. I mean, you're handling, one worker can handle it, no problem. And a lot of it is done manually it's almost like you're doing a tile, right? But we don't build with 5-ton stones. Go show me a prop. Now, somebody may bring in one art piece or something with a crane, a big stone, and set it or something, but we don't build with 5-ton stones or 10-ton stones, certainly 20-ton stones. Why not? Well, because in our modern advanced industrial civilization, building with stones like that would be incredibly uneconomical.
Yeah.
Right? It would take a lot of energy to do that, right? Well, if it's not economically viable for us to do it today, and it obviously isn't because we're not doing that, could it have been for more what we call primitive people? Well, it would have been 100 times more uneconomical for them to in their off season when they're not migrating, nomads following the game herds, when they're not planting seeds and bringing in the crops. Oh, in their spare time, they're going to go, 100 miles away, 20 miles away, quarry, 5-ton stones and haul them back. It just doesn't make sense.
No.
I'm sorry, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it seems to be a very deliberate, sophisticated planning that I have not done a deep dive into, mainstream Egyptology, so I'm sure that there are explanations for this. But even just like the decision-making process of deciding like where we're going to go and how we're going to get all this limestone, not to mention all of the granite that is used for like the base, from my understanding, and stuff like that, which is even harder to explain, right? These gigantic granite blocks that are some of the hardest Mohs scale rocks in the world.
Yes.
What the hell, man?
Well, that's the question. What the hell?
Do pardon the interruption, my friends. We riff on a lot of somewhat obscure esoteric ideas, both on the channel collectively and in this mind meld in particular. And you're going to specifically all the time hear me blabbing about the Hermetic and Platonic traditions. Even getting to the core of what those are is somewhat of an intellectual labyrinthian adventure. But when it comes to that adventure, you should 100% make this beautiful limited edition version of Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition a part of that adventure. It profiles the hugely fascinating Giordano Bruno, who lectured on cosmology, philosophy, memory, and many other topics through the prism of Hermeticism and Neoplatonism. And if you don't know Bruno's story, he's eventually arrested and burned at the stake for espousing his philosophy. And another note on the influence of this book, I think I first heard about it in a Terence McKenna lecture. So it is one of those books you're just going to keep hearing about. So if you're going to get it, get this version, my friends, but it will sell out, and do get it via our link that's in the description. It's also up on the screen now. And by the way, the guys at Gallo Glass Books, they are so cool. They really have their hearts in the right place. They're making super high quality products, and they're really trying to do this content justice. So I love supporting them.
Well, that's the question. What the hell?
Yeah.
And that it should be asked with that kind of an attitude, like, what the hell were they doing?
Yeah.
And
exactly.
okay, the way I put it sometimes says, okay, we can imagine if you've got a dozen cultures ultimately that are building, I'll call them megalithic cultures that are building with large stones. That's one thing. Okay, if you've got one culture that for whatever reason, we'll call it an idiosyncrasy, but for whatever reason, they like to spend all their spare time working their butts off, quarrying stones and moving them and building them into these magnificent temples in their spare time, right? Well, you can imagine one culture. Oh, okay, yeah, okay. They're. Hey, you know what? This culture was really quite weird and unique and special because look what they did, right? But when you have a dozen cultures, then it changes the equation. It changes the parameters of the questions you're asking because wait, okay, you might be able to say that this is a standalone situation. You got this culture over here for whatever reason they're inspired to motivate to quarry 5-ton stones, 10 tons, or whatever, right? But when you see it over and over again, which essentially defies the conceptual models of what people were doing then, what civilization looked like, well, now that poses to me a major paradox.
Yeah.
Almost like somebody has said, okay, you guys figure this one out. You know, it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense that you would have this many cultures all around the world in history, ancient history, doing that, doing the same sort of thing, and doing it with incredible skill and precision.
Yep.
See, now to do that, you're talking about skill levels that take lifetimes to master. So, what are you telling me that basically farmers or foragers, hunter gatherers are in their spare time developing these engineering skills and the ability to shape stone and transport stone on the level that we're seeing? No, again, it just doesn't add up.
Right.
And the so-called skeptics, oh well, the mainstream uh, the experts say that it was built so and so by so and so, and that's the end of the discussion.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's got to the point now where I think we got to admit that when we're talking in this field, there are no experts. So we're in the position of being almost required to advance what William R. Davis, the founder of geomorphology, said in back 1926 when he wrote a seminal article called The Value of Outrageous Hypotheses. Because by the early 20th century, the field he was in was getting so straitjacketed in their thinking. And he said, no, you got to break out of that and be willing to actually look. And he goes through a long list of things that by the 1926 had been considered too bizarre, too out in left field to actually consider. Plate tectonics, for example, being one. And in fact, plate tectonics was not an accepted theory of Earth change until after I was born. Right. So when I was born in 51, we had no model that other than the eccentrics, the pseudo experts, right, who were not going along with the textbook explanation, which essentially viewed the Earth as completely unchanging, except for processes that preceded one grain of sand and one drop of water at a time. Right. That was a very strict gradualist model of Earth history, mid 20th century. I grew up with that. I was taught that in school. Everything takes millions of years. And what had happened is because the calendar of Earth history went from 7,000 years, say, up to millions and then hundreds of millions of years. So if you're trying to fit a model of Earth change into a 7,000-year framework, well, my God, everything has to happen awfully doggone quick, back to back, right? It implies catastrophism, right? But now if you get long millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, well, now you've got all the time you need. So in 7,000 years, there's a major missing ingredient, and that missing ingredient has now been supplied by virtually, from human perspective, infinite time to accomplish things. So when you're explaining the world around you, everything is the end of a long incremental continuum that at any given time is almost not even noticeable. The change is going on. Right.
Yeah.
That's the uniformitarian, the gradualist model.
And it really lends itself to a materialistic, bottom up, hill climbing, random. There is nothing sacred. There is no consciousness. It's all just random mutations and twists of circumstance and lucky species after lucky species. But I do want to double down on that question, man, of what do you think these structures like the Great Pyramid are? I mean, from my perspective, the only thing that would possess a culture to do something like that is like a sacred obsession. Being so deeply pious and so
Mm.
strongly connected to something that we have lost touch with,
Mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm.
would even make people want to converge together to do this like Heraclean effort over the
Yeah,
course of probably many lifetimes.
right.
Unless it's something crazy like a Nephilim or some super advanced civilization, of something we can't even uh, imagine, or alien intervention, which I give all of those things. I'll preserve a couple percent for the really outlandish possibilities. But
Sure.
if we're talking humans, I think it's got to be like a sacred level obsession, a societal level connection to something higher, that is not imaginary, that is not psychological, but is very real, to a point where, I mean, where I will go out on a limb is, I think maybe they were getting directions to some degree, directions from something else on what to do, how to imbue these structures, from with everything from practical geometric elements to sacred geometric elements that people like you are like the 0.1% of people look at that and see. But before I ramble on, yeah, back to
But no,
that,
I'm
yeah,
following you
yeah,
100%. And I'll take it over and I'll say then that in order to, I think, to try to assess or access, better word, access the mindset and the intentions of our predecessors are in ancient history, we have to first of all understand that what they're doing is about merging the sacred and the mundane,
right, right, right,
so that the physical world around, I mean, I think this is clearly discernible now, that the patterns of their culture, of their civilization, and what we're seeing is the remnants of those uh, at the very dawn of what we think of as history, 4,500 to 5,000 years ago, with the advent of writing, basically. But what we see is an attempt over and over again. And see, this is some of this pattern of consistency. Well, okay, we can say, yeah, people all over the place quarried big stones. Now, in North America, they didn't so much quarry big stones, but they hauled and stacked up and arranged um, hundreds of thousands, millions of tons, right, actually, of monumental earthwork structures. Okay, so, but in addition to that commonality, the ability to apparently material transport was not a big deal to them. It seems that one of the consistent themes of all of these cultures and their physical expression was they were attempting to duplicate in some respect the heavens.
yes,
And to monitor like the movement of the heavens. So, like, there were certain fixed points and there were moving points, just like in geometry. When you draw a circle with a compass, there's a fixed point and there's a moving point. In the book of Genesis, we've got 6 days of creation and 1 day of rest. We could take that as a geometric metaphor, because in a compass, you draw a circle, the radius setting of that compass will exactly step around with mathematic perfection the perimeter of that circle, right? So, and then, but at the center, you've got that, if you want to think of it as the 6 days of creation, those are the 6 days of activity, and you've got the day of rest, the seventh day in the center. That represents the dot, the point of the compass, right? So you've got that idea, again, all prevailing
yeah,
in many different cultures, this idea, and it's kind of a geometric metaphor. But you've got this idea that what's going on down here reflects the patterns of the heavens. So
hmm,
certain key points were defined and delineated, whether it was beginning with the solstices and the equinoxes. Those were the obvious ones. Then you went to the cross quarter points. Then you went to the lunar motions, which were also tracked with a great deal of precision. Um, and so then you get this question. This, to me, it's like the secondary question, which is that, well, they were doing this, the farmers were doing this because so they know when to plant the crops.
hmm,
This is, a standard explanation, right? Or when to harvest the crops. Now, if you want to know the seasons of the year, all you really need to do is you put a stick in the ground and you draw a circle around it. and then you use the shadows cast by the stick to define the cosmic angles, the positions of the sun, which are going to change with your latitude. Why would you have any reason, though, for example, um, to be able to mark the 18.6-year cycle of the moon? I mean, if you're a farmer, I don't know any farmers today who, beyond a general or growing up,
Mm-hmm.
who had a general knowledge of the moon. You know, you knew exactly. I mean, you knew when new moon was, you knew when full moon, you knew quarter moon. Beyond that, you'd have no reason to know the maximum northern moon rise, the maximum southern moon rise, the minimum northern moon rise, all based on a cycle that takes 18.6 years
Yeah.
to fulfill. Yet we find this movement of the lunar cycle incorporated into the geometry and orientation of numerous ancient structures.
Wow.
Right now, we have structures that have been built so that once you've got your basic horizon calendar, that's what it's referred to. You think of it, if you can find a nice big flat field, and you'd set up, let's say, a wood hinge with stone. I mean, with wood piers, or you do it with stone. However, you get your vantage point that's going to be at the center of that circle, and then you can say, okay, there's, for me here, I'm looking to the east, but so on spring equinox, the sun is going to rise directly. I'm oriented facing due east right now, so that's where it's going to rise, right? But it's only going to rise there one day out of the year. It'll rise east, set east, and then the rest of the time it's going to be shifting over to my left,
Mm-hmm.
which is to the north, or it's going to be shifting over to my right, which is the south. Okay, but those movements are incorporated almost as if you're projecting from the movement of the heavens, and then you get
Yeah.
those positions on the horizon, and now from your viewing, your vantage point, your sacred center, you then stretch a line, and that's a fixed line,
Right.
right? And now you work from there, and you orient this structure to key points. So what you have to do now is you have to coordinate the movements of the heavens, which is a function of time, right? Because the Pleiades do not arise on the horizon the same place every
Mm.
day, right? There's a cycle, a Pleiadian cycle. There's the lunar cycle. There's the sun cycle. There's the position of Sirius on the horizon. So now you establish these fixed points in space. You're taking the movements of the heavens, and now you're establishing a moment. Let's say sunrise on the moment of summer solstice, right? Stonehenge prominently has that alignment built into it. So now you're looking at the point on the horizon where the sun rises on that day. The most far north is it's going to rise on the horizon, right? Solstice means to stand still. So the sun is moving at its, if you're tracking, where does the sun rise against a flat horizon every day? And every day it's going to be in a different position, right? And if you're tracking this over a lifetime or multiple lifetimes, or even just a few years, very closely, you're going to notice, well, as it moves towards the east point, which the equinox, the days and the nights are changing their relative lengths, right?
Yeah.
And also the movement of that rising point, it's not uniform throughout the cycle. It's going much faster as it goes past the equinoctial points, and then it slows down as it's coming to the solstitial points. It pauses, it hangs there for like what would appear to be a few days, and then it starts moving gradually back to the north, picking up speed, crosses the east point, let's say, and then does the same thing as you get to summer or winter solstice. So
Mm-hmm.
you've got this cycle, and it's discernible. And you so if you're taking each day, here's the east point. Okay, there's the point on the horizon. Well, I
Mm-hmm.
put a stick
Mm-hmm.
there to mark that point from my sacred center. The next day, it's moved a little bit, let's say, to the north, because because spring is coming on, summer's coming on. Next day, it moves a little bit further north. Each day, you put a stick in the ground there, and then what you're going to see is that the sticks are a whole lot closer together around equinox than they are at solstices,
Mm.
because it's slowing down. You can see right there. So ancient cultures were very much about celebrating this the winter solstice, particularly because it represented the return of the sun, the return of the light.
Yeah.
And they would watch it, and there would be someone within the culture whose job it was to track that motion. And then if you don't know anything, if you don't have any scientific basis and you don't have any memory beyond a year, you're going to see each day the sun moving further away to the south, days getting shorter, nights getting longer. And so now what happens is solstice comes, that movement stops, and then it reverses. And after about typically around 3 days of observation, it's becoming obvious that the sun is returning, the light is returning. And coincidentally, the way that works out, like right now, given that winter solstice is, just typically December 21, 22, those 3 days when it becomes obvious through observation that the light is returning, we celebrate Christmas.
Yeah.
And that has its roots. I mean, it's embedded in our culture, it's embedded in our consciousness, but those rhythms are deep.
Yeah.
They go deep into ancient prehistory.
Totally. Yeah.
And we're still preserving that.
And so
the question then becomes, and then I'm going to shut up for a second. The question then becomes this. Okay, that's an obvious one. Equinoxes and solstices. But why would you go to such tremendous and great efforts to memorialize, let's say, that 18.6-year cycle of the moon?
Yeah.
And we find it in Europe, we find it in North America, we find it in South America.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we find it in Africa. Yes, we do find it in there. I can think of several instances. And then, of course, obviously in Egypt. But we know it's in China as well. Somebody was tracking that cycle of the moon. Why would you do that? And why would presumably disparate cultures that had no real connection with each other all be doing the same thing? I can show you examples where we can pull up. I've got multiple examples where you've got structures that were aligned with the summer solstice sunrise. There's a structure, Casa Rinconada, out at Chaco Canyon. It's a circular structure. It's got a window, and it's got a niche on the inside of the opposite wall. And on the summer solstice sunrise, the sun rises, and only on that day, then the shaft of light, which passes through that window, illuminates a niche, or a niche. How do you say the word? A niche. I always said it, a niche, in the opposite wall. That niche undoubtedly held some type of an effigy, some type of a sacred object that would have been illuminated on that morning. So somebody is there observing that. There's probably a ritual, a ceremony around it, this circular structure. At the same time, presumably, you've got Druids or whoever over in England, some kind of a ritual, some kind of ceremony, making the exact same alignment where the shaft of light comes through, it crosses over the heel stone, passes through the aperture between the sarsen stone uprights, and illuminates what was then probably an upright stone that is still there, called the altar stone.
So fascinating.
It is. It's fascinating, and I'm going to give the ball back to you, because I think what I'm trying to do is set up the question of why would they be doing this? And I mean, we've only just scratched the surface here of these kind of this parallelism. What do you make of it?
In a nutshell, I think, and I think this harmonizes with everything you've said, is that these sites are like massive sacred talismans that are designed to draw down some kind of sacred power that imbues these places with some kind of real spiritual presence. There are the words for this that I'm the most familiar with are Greek words. So there's this word teleste, and there's all these telestic arts, which is essentially, I think, the most common word we use to translate that into English is perfection. So, so for example, the innermost sanctum at Eleusis was the telesterion, or the telestrion. That's the place that you would personally go to be perfected. And that was also the most holy place in the whole, temple complex.
Right.
But there's so many other elements to this too, because there's also these like theurgic practices that are designed to do the same thing, where you're drawing divinity down into the individual. So these telistic arts and these theurgic arts sort of overlap, where essentially what they are trying to do is draw the sacred down into an object or into a location. And you did this. So there's a great book by the classicist Gregory Shaw called Theurgy and the Soul.
Okay.
And he says, and this is coming from Iamblichus, the Neoplatonic sage who's like very heavily associated with theurgic practices. And there's this core idea that theurgy is demiurgy, meaning to create like the creator, the demiurge, not in the Gnostic sense, but in the Platonic, like Timaeus sense. This is
Okay.
everybody online is obsessed with the like evil Gnostic demiurge now. But as you know,
Okay. I didn't know that. But
before there was the evil demiurge, there was, which just means creator, by the way. There's the creator
right.
of
Right.
Plato's Timaeus, which is like the divine consciousness that used all of the forms and logos to create the cosmos, create human souls, create the planetary governors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the ancients knew this. They knew that to be like the creator would allow you to unlock certain powers. And you needed to, apparently ascertain these pieces of logic or these pieces of logos or logoi and put those and instantiate these sacred properties within the physical world. And by mimicking these sacred properties, you were becoming more like the divine, and you were also making these places more like the divine. And what that really did, I don't know, but I suspect that it's got to be something when you look at the level of undertaking that all of these
yes.
cultures went. And yeah, I'm making a leap because I don't know if Mayans were doing the same thing as Greco-Egyptian, Neoplatonists, but we do know that the Greeks and the Hellenes were like massive Egyptophiles, and that actually
Yeah.
one of the most famous pieces of correspondence with Iamblichus is actually him using his Egyptian priest name. So he's not calling himself Iamblichus, he's using his Egyptian priest name in this correspondence with Porphyry, who's Porphyry is
Mm.
this other Neoplatonist who's sort of
Right.
skeptical of theurgy. But that aside, that's where my mind goes, is that you can't just look at this from like our modern POV, thinking about construction techniques, thinking about technology. Like those pieces are interesting, and I think they're relevant because yeah, how the fuck did they do that stuff like from a technical standpoint? But also maybe we can't answer that question unless we think from this angle. Maybe
hmm
by creating this rapport with higher intelligences, higher beings, maybe alien beings. That's not my preferred sort of
hmm
vernacular, but
Right.
whatever, like the higher, maybe by aligning yourself with the higher, that communication channel becomes more clear and you see things that now look impossible to us as possible somehow.
Yeah. And I think in the zeitgeist of those times, they didn't they didn't perceive reality with the
Mm,
modern dichotomy that we do.
right.
You know, again, getting back to this separating the sacred and the mundane. The mundane was infused with sacredness. Now, where I come from, I certainly can appreciate that from an aesthetic standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint. But then there's a part of me that wants to understand what specifically do we mean by that.
Hmm.
Um, and if we talk about a place uh, or a thing being infused with some kind of sacredness, a special power, like a power place, what do we actually mean by that? Can we
Yeah.
actually, is it something completely subjective or is there an objective dimension to it?
Right.
I believe there is an objective dimension to it. And I believe that what they were doing was understanding this integration of the greater and the lesser, that they had a sort of a fractal concept of reality. And so it's no coincidence from that perspective that many temples incorporate aspects or elements or even proportions of the human body.
Right.
You know, the work of Schwaller de Lubitsch, which was very much about uh, he wrote and spent a lot of time at the Luxor Karnak complex there along the Nile River. And after, decades of study, he came to this realization that it was essentially an architectural model of the human body. And within that, there were places within the temple complex that were special, that were potent in some kind of way, and they have a Vedic connection in that, that represents the power centers. Might call them the chakras in
Yeah.
the human body. But when we start talking about chakras, we're now talking about transition points between, if you want to call it, the dimensional strata. We exist mostly with our consciousness embedded in the physical and in the physical body, right? But many, many traditions have this belief or this recognition of much more subtle bodies, if you
Yeah.
will. And I think we are interestingly about on the threshold of being able to provide at least a quasi-scientific explanation for that, and can actually say, here's what we're actually talking about in an objective sense. Something happens, some unique alchemy happens, both some within the human body, within the body of the temple, within the body of the earth, and it's ultimately a reflection of the pulses and rhythms that are happening on a cosmic scale. And all of those pulses, those rhythms, and those cycles, the periodicities, whatever you want to call them, they're microscopically encoded into our existence. Not only our physical bodies that we inhabit, not only the processes of growth from a single cell into an adult human being, but also the rhythm and tempos of our day-to-day life. And what we have done, and that brings me off to an idea which is an interesting to point out. There are elements of our day-to-day life that are deeply rooted in the sacred,
Yeah.
that we essentially use every day without any second thought about it, where it came from. You know, for example, I'll give you examples. In terms of space, we use the mile. Now, here in America, we use the mile. In other European countries, they use a kilometer. But the mile, do you happen to know, Michael, right off the top of your head, how many
Oh,
feet in a mile? I'm putting you
4,000
on
or
the
sorry,
spot now.
5,000 5,820?
You're close. You're close. 5,280 feet.
5,280? I'm
Yeah,
definitely going to put that
5,200.
before. I'm going to put that before to make it seem like I knew.
Yeah. Well, you were
No, I won't.
close.
I
I
won't.
mean, you were close. And different cultures had different lengths of the mile. So we call it a mile. Where does the mile come from? Well, I presume it's coming ultimately from the Latin, which means 1,000, because our imperial mile, as it's called, which we've inherited from Britain, is 5,200. Why 5,280 feet? Well, okay, so the explanation there is usually, well, they measured the foot of the king, and maybe it was King Edward or whoever, but I don't remember the specific king, but that was usually kind of the parochial explanation,
Yeah.
right? Well, it's interesting that if you like take Stonehenge, for example, and there's enough of it remaining that hasn't been damaged or destroyed that you can do a pretty precise reconstruction of the geometry. There's a geometric template that they didn't just go randomly, we'll put this stone here and let's, maybe, we'll get a circle, we'll eyeball it, and, that's going to suffice. But it's much more precise than that. When you look at the lintel stones that have been carved with mortise and tenon system sitting on top of the vertical uprights, and you look at the blue stones, you look at the horseshoe trilithon, the biggest stones in the middle. Okay, all of those are laid out according to a very precise geometry. Now, you can quibble over an inch or a couple of inches, right? But if you measure from the geometric center to the outer face of the big prominent sarsen stone ring, it works out to be 52.8 feet. Now, when I say 0.8 feet, we could go 0.7, 0.9, depending. But, if you look at over when I was looking at some of this stuff years ago, I think I found 3 different surveys or reconstructions of Stonehenge. So the point is that you can quibble over an inch or two or a few inches, even 3 or 4 inches. But if you were to use this geometric template, and of course it's theoretical, and I were going to reconstruct Stonehenge, not necessarily with 10-ton stones, but hey, maybe I'm just going to do a wood henge, or set up formwork and do poured concrete,
Yeah.
whatever. I could use this template, geometric template, lay it out according to that, and for all practical purposes, it would be basically a reconstruction of Stonehenge. Well, 52.8 feet, right? So if you have 100 of those, 52.8, then you've got, then you've got 528 feet. If you got 1,000 of them, if you take 5.28 feet times 1,000, well, now you have 5,280 feet, which is a mile.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did they intend to use that unit of a 5.28? Well, if you take the center line of the lintels, the horizontal lintels, and you look at each one is mortise and tenoned into the next one. So the you had a square, think here's your block of stone.
Mm-hmm.
You had a square blunt end, and you had this triangular tenon on the end of it. Then the next stone had a mortise. It had a female where you would insert, because we see they still exist, right? And the stones were very carefully carved to have just enough arc that when you put 30 of them together, you got a full circle.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the distance between the uprights turned out to be 10.56 feet. Right? Okay, so what does that mean? Well, 10.56. So, 10.56 times 3 was 3168. 1056 times 5 was 5,280.
Mm.
So now this is conjectural, but it's not so outrageous.
Yeah.
What we might be looking at here is that they were using a system of metrology that had a mile, which was 1,000. Now, when we say 1,000, what are we talking specifically about in the dimensions of the mile? We're talking about 1,000 paces or strides, depending on which language you use. But that means, let's say, Michael, you go out on a flat field and you're going to pace off. How far is it across the field?
Mm-hmm.
So what you do is you start counting, and you don't count every footfall. You count each time, let's say, your right foot hits the ground, right? And we'll call that a pace. Now, you go out. I've pointed this out before, and some of the pseudo critics will get on and they say, well, people's, the length of their pace varied. And of course it did. So at some point, to have it usable, you have to standardize it. You have to standardize it. Now,
but you could do that with a really simple tool that you carry with you or something to do.
Yeah. It's not a big deal. It's not a big, and the simplest tool is just you walking and counting every time your right foot hits the ground.
Or a stick, like you use a stick that length, and that's your pace or something.
Yeah. Well, somebody commented, good God, they said, that must have been a huge, had to be a giant, to have a pace of
now we're getting
5.28 feet.
Now we're getting somewhere.
Wait a minute. No, we're not talking about a single step. We're talking about, like, if you're right foot, left foot, left foot, each one of those was 5.28 feet. Yeah, you would be a big guy, a really big guy. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about every other one. Mm-hmm. So you have to actually say that if you took 5.28 feet and divided it by 2, you'd have 2.64 feet, which is now still a pretty big guy. I figured I worked it out one time, and it was about a guy about my size. I'm, an inch. I used to be. I'm compelled to admit, I used to be 6'1.5". I'm only 6'1" now.
Ooh.
So, yeah,
got to stretch you out.
I know. I got to maybe start hanging from my feet or whatever. But anyways, Here's the thing: because of the fact that if you take that center line of the lintels on top, and you divide it by the number of sarsen stone uprights, 30 of them, what you come up with, and you use precisely that point, and we're defining the center line where the tenon, which is triangular, fits into the triangular slot. And if we were to lay out a compass, draw a circle there, divide it into 30, then what happens is that each one of those becomes 10.56 feet. So half of that now is 5.28 feet. So it looks like they were using something based upon a unit of measurement that was unified around 5.28 feet.
Hmm.
And then if you got 100 of those and then 1,000, well, 1,000 of those, which now corresponds to the human pace, right? You've got a mile. A mile
Yeah.
means 1,000. So you go out and you count out 1,000 paces. If you're a guy about my size, you're going to have roughly, somewhere between a 5 and a 6 foot pace, right? Let's say we standardize it for 5.28. Um, and so what that would mean, though, and here's where it's an interesting implication. It would mean that our mile is a holdover, our imperial mile, that nobody really can say ultimately where was it first originally used. But this provides at least evidence, not proof, of course, but evidence that unit, our mile might be descended from a unit of a system of measurement being used to lay out Stonehenge. That's
Yeah.
what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and you do a great job in so many pods I've seen with you over the years of showing how this is not unique to one structure. Like that there's a mile encoded into the Great Pyramid too, right? Like there's the
Mm-hmm.
size of the earth encoded into the Great Pyramid. And these are the types of things where you either have to chalk them up to like I mean, I think there's three possibilities. Massive insane synchronicity. One, two, people really being in touch with some kind of higher wisdom that is somehow instructing them to do this. Three, a literal culture that's teaching people how to do this, or they're building it themselves and leaving it as sort of these like, multimodal uh nodes of wisdom, of like sacred wisdom, technical wisdom, geometric wisdom, all of these different things. um and there's a couple other possibilities I'm not thinking of as well. I mean, I guess the other possibility is like we're making this up from our modern POV and we're discovering all of these things that are super complex. So because of their complexity, it's sort of like Moby Dick, right? Within Moby Dick, you could find all kinds of crazy patterns, and like lose your mind thinking there's a secret code within Moby Dick. Maybe it's the same thing. Maybe that's the skeptical take on all of this stuff about
Mm.
these megalithic structures. I don't know. But to me, that does not seem like the most parsimonious thing. What seems like the most parsimonious thing is that there was an incredible amount of sophistication, an incredible amount of purposefulness in all of these things, and quite possibly some kind of actual through line. And you've
Mm-hmm.
talked about this idea before of there being potentially this like breakaway civilization that could be Atlantean, could be something else. Um, do you place that as your highest likelihood hypothesis that there is some kind of like singular breakaway civilization that is the source of all of this like antediluvian temple building telestic wisdom that's out there?
Well, yes, in a way. Although I would need to qualify that by
Sure.
saying that by saying that um, when you say a breakaway civilization, I think we can definitely, like, to use Graham Hancock's terminology, speak of fingerprints. The
Hmm.
fingerprints are all over the place, right?
Yeah.
But who left those fingerprints? Um, and ultimately, what is the source of that knowledge? Let's preface it by calling it sacred knowledge, even though there's a lot of implications to that. Generally, if you say sacred knowledge, you're not necessarily talking about scientific knowledge. Well, it depends. Remember Arthur C. Clarke's dictum that any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from science. Well, I think that
Magic.
kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
applies here. It applies here. Yet we're talking about a holy science, a sacred science, to use a term that has been used by a number of researchers over the years, sacred science, where that artificial dichotomy doesn't exist, right? That science and religion, or science, better term, maybe spirituality, do not exist in two distinct and separate domains. There's a fusion between the two. And so essentially, I do think now that the evidence is overwhelming that there were predecessor cultures that were practicing sacred science, right? And it had it not only related to the world as it existed in space and time, it also pertained to the individual, who, in a
Yeah.
sense, was a microcosmic recreation, first of the world, but then of the larger universe as a whole, right? We are the end product of this long, incredibly complex continuum between the raw material being produced in the nuclei of stars
Right.
that now makes up our body. That to me is the ultimate alchemy. But
Totally.
I think that in the Hermetic wisdom, there was a type of a knowledge of those kinds of processes and how to translate those processes to the human scale. But you had to have almost like, in a sense, a step down transformer. The step down transformer was the vast temple complex that was being erected around the world.
Yeah.
And I think here's a working hypothesis that a lot of what we see in terms of the building of suddenly you went from blurry, you went back to blurry,
Oh,
but you got very clear there for a second.
it won't. It's going to upload the native side, so it won't be blurry in the final product.
Oh, that's good. That's
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
because, yeah, I mean, we don't want to have a good-looking guy like you blurred out. People need to
Oh,
be say because
buttering
we're
me up
talking about,
already.
yeah, we're talking here about proportions, artistic perfection, and so on. So we need to see you as you really look. And I'm seeing a very blurred version of you, Michael. But I know it's going to look
That's
fine
just you.
in
That's just.
post.
No, I'm just
Oh,
kidding.
that's just me.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the scales that are on
Yeah.
my eyes.
Yes.
I need to rip the scales off my eyes so I can see the truth and reality for what it is. But what I'm getting at here is that we're microcosmic representations of the entire cosmos. Now, if we're going to segue over into the question of make an effort, an attempt at scientific explanation, if we want to somehow fuse the aspects of, let's say, our intuition with our reasoning power, with our higher ability to perceive alternate realities, well, we have to kind of start somewhere. Like when I studied meditation, what did it begin with? It began with a repetition of a mantra and the control of your breath. But that wasn't just random. You're breathing like in tantric yoga. The whole idea is you're aligning your breathing rhythms with literally the rhythms of the cosmos, which are the rhythms of our day-to-day existence. Now, we talked about the origin of the mile. Well, here's another thing that you take and the mile, of course, is a way of measuring space, right? Well, let's talk about time for a second. Okay, you know how many seconds there are in a day?
Man, putting me 60 times 24. I
Well,
don't
it's
know off the top of
60
my head.
times 60 times
Sorry,
24.
60 times 60 times 24.
Now, I should have
But
warned you ahead of time. Listen, Michael, if you have a calculator, get one next to you, and we'll have
oh,
fun with it when. But I
yeah,
can
I
tell
do.
you,
I do. I do.
you do.
I have my phone.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, cool. Okay, so then do this.
60 times.
I'm a little hoarse today. Do this. 24 hours, 60 minutes. How many minutes in a day? Let's start with that one.
Well, I already got the other answer. It's
Okay,
86,400 seconds.
86,400. Right.
Yeah.
Now, there's something special about that number. Right. Now, if I was going to draw a circle that had a diameter of 86,400 units of anything, what would its radius be? Its
Units
radius
of.
would be half of that, wouldn't it? 43,200 radius. Yeah, if you're translating it into a circle. Okay, well, when we now our day is ultimately based on a circle, isn't it? Well, what is
Yeah.
that circle? The circle is we establish a point, let's say on the meridian line of the Earth, and we align that meridian line with the dead center of the sun. And then as the Earth rotates through one day night cycle, a diurnal cycle on its axis, that meridian line will come back around, and depending on your instrumentation, you can define that alignment of the local meridian with the center of the sun to a high degree of precision. Somebody in ancient times decided we're going to take that cycle and we're going to divide it into 86,400 sub units. But who
Yeah.
and when? Well, before you get there, you take the circle, and you know that the circle has 360 degrees. So if we lay out a circle on the flat ground again, and we mark out 360 degrees, and let's say we take a clock face, a big clock, and we lay it on the ground. That's essentially almost how you could look at what they were doing.
Yeah. Sundial.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the movement of the sun And okay, so now you've got the pillar, the gnomon pole, or the stick, whatever it is, the obelisk, whatever it might be, that's at the center. It's casting shadows, and those shadows moving throughout the course of the day, you could almost think of as the hands on a clock. But if you take 60 minutes and 24 hours, somebody had to first of all, we're going to divide the day into 24 hours, not 25, not 23, not 14 and a half. We're going to
Right.
divide it into 24 hours. And each of those we're going to correlate with a geometric diagram where we divide a degree into 60 parts, right? So we have in our clock, we have hours, minutes, seconds, right? And that's the measure of time.
Mm-hmm.
Now in geometry, which is a measure of space, we've got degrees, minutes, and seconds, don't we? Right? You have X number minutes of arc, X number of minutes of seconds, right? Well, so what you're saying is we've got the initial division, unit of division, and now we're going to divide that into 60 minute parts.
Yep.
Hence the word minute, right?
Yeah.
Now we're going to take each of those minute parts and divide them again into 60 smaller parts, secondary parts, right? So we've got hours, minutes, seconds, which are the second level of subdivision. Got it? So now, at some point, somebody said, okay, we're going to put 86,400 of those units in one diurnal cycle. Exactly. Well, interestingly, you go back into the ancient traditions and you find that number repeated over and over and over again. That number, and it's multiple, it's submultiples and its multiples were all part of this pantheon of numbers, whether it manifested as the king lists in Sumeria, the 10 antediluvian kings, whether it manifested as the great Yuga and Kalpa cycles in the Vedas, right? It was built upon those numbers. The total value of the 10 antediluvian kings was 432,000 years. The total value of the Maha Yuga in the Kalpas was 4,320,000 years.
Oh, interesting.
Not in the Kalpa, I'm sorry, in the Maha Yuga, which was the encompassing of all the other the Kali Yuga, which was essentially the fundamental unit of the system, was 432,000 years. Then it went to 864,000 years. That was the Dwapara Yuga. Then to Treta Yuga was 3 times the fundamental unit, 1,296,000. And then the Satya Yuga, which was 4 times that, so 1,728,000. And then you had the Maha Yuga, the great Yuga that encompassed all the others, and it was 4,320,000 years. So you can see now the relationship, it's a 10-to-1 relation. The Maha Yuga is 10 times the length of the Kali Yuga. Now, when you start looking at the king lists, you start with these huge numbers, but when you add them all together, you find that the durations of the king's reigns were submultiples of the so in other words, you could multiply those numbers usually by an integral value, and you would get the full duration of the whole span of all the antediluvian kings, which was 432,000 years. So now you look at the Sumerian system, and they're following those numbers up to 432,000, and that's where it stops. Now the Vedas pick up and they build the system on top of the 432,000. It looks to me like you've got a continuum of what may have been an original system of measuring time. But here's the point. We're still using those units today. And who can tell me when was the origin of the hour? When was the origin of the minute?
I don't know.
When was the decision made that we're going to divide the diurnal cycle into 1,440 minutes? And that's how many minutes there are in a day. Then we opened the Bible and we discovered there's 144 cubits in the great circular wall of the holy city. We discovered that there's 144,000 redeemed of the earth that presumably are the survivors of the apocalypse, the epoch of the ellipse, right? And we can find the number in the Baktun cycle in the Mayans, 1,440. And we find it in all kinds of places that are not so readily discernible once we dive into some of the interior
Yeah.
realms of some of the ancient traditions. We find this repetition of this system of cosmological numbers.
Yeah, it's like you're identifying the pixels of the matrix. You're identifying the letters potentially of the secret language of this breakaway civilization when you start digging into questions like this and you start elucidating these connections. Either that
Right.
or we're doing some kind of crazy mathematical, schizo conjecture, but that is too coincidental for me, my friend. Like that
Oh, I
feels
agree.
way too coincidental.
I totally agree. And if you think about the resolution of your computer screen, what is it? Typically 1080 by
1920.
1920, right?
Yep.
1920.
I knew
Now
that one.
1080, what's 4 times 1080?
Uh, yeah,
4,320,
yeah.
right? What's 8 times 1080 is 8,000 is what did I say? 1080 times 4 was what? What did I say?
I'll,
Times it's getting past my nap time. Yeah, 4320,
yeah,
right? So then 8 times 1080 is 8,640. Now, by whatever coincidence, if we take now and we take that unit of measurement, which we ultimately assume to be derivative of the human scale dimension, and we project it onto the cosmos, we find some interesting correlations. Like it works out that the radius of the sun is virtually 432 million miles, and its diameter 864 million. I'm sorry, 432,000 miles. It's a good thing it's not 432 million miles because we wouldn't be having this
no,
conversation right
no,
now. But
no.
no, 432,000 miles, radius of the sun, right? What's half of that 43,200? Well, it's 21,600, right? Now, when we project onto the dimensions of the moon, it comes up to be very, very close to
Yeah,
2,160 miles, right? So we can begin to find these numbers embedded in the architecture of our solar system.
yeah,
And they show up not only in the measure of time and in the measure of space, both. So what we're finding here is that there seems to be, we've inherited remnants of a system of numeration, right, that was used transculturally around the planet in various ways, and it links directly into the ancient systems of not only space measure but time measure as well.
yeah. That's
Now,
so crazy. That's
but
so
here's it
crazy.
ultimately what it really, and then I'm going to hand the ball back to you. I think ultimately the significance of it is that we're talking about when we look at these numbers, we think in terms of geometry, then we're thinking in terms of ratio fundamentally, then proportion. Um, so, what is it that about the reiterative occurrence of these numbers? I think that ultimately involves frequencies
Mm,
and gets us into the realm of vibration.
yeah,
You know that our modern octave is built upon 440 to 880, but there's a lot of evidence in our people who are working on it that that the ancient octave went
yeah,
from 432 cycles per second to 864 cycles per second, and that was from beginning A to the octave A at the next higher octave level. So those numbers are showing up. We say cycles per second. Well, that particular note of A would not vibrate at 432 cycles per second unless we picked that
right.
particular length of time for the
Hmm.
second. So, but once we do that, then we find that nature has given us frequencies that now vibrate consistent with those units that we're employing to measure both time and space. That
Yeah,
can't be a coincidence.
no, no. Man, I have a hard time picking where I want to go because you introduced several super fascinating topics, and I think all of them. I think all of them, to put it in some sort of conversational nutshell that is cohesive for the conversation, point to essentially exactly what you're saying, that there's some kind of lost system that we still have these remnants of. And when
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned the hermetic wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
there's this whole, like, there's a lot of the well-known hermetic texts, and these are mostly called like the philosophical hermetica, right? The Asclepius, all of that well-known
Yeah.
stuff. But there's also the technical Hermetica, which is way less known, and I believe there's a lot less translations of. But you get certain like interesting overlaps in philosophical and technical Hermetica through people like Zosimus. And this gets back to what you were saying too about this idea of, you know, this all plays back into some like all these varying levels of alchemy, like where I really think you could see all this telistic stuff with the pyramid building and like the megalithic structure
Mm.
building as a form of alchemy. This is just not a word
Absolutely.
we didn't use that word yet. But when you look at someone like Zosimus, who is a hermeticist, and he's coming from that hermetic Greco-Egyptian milieu, now you have somebody who is like uniting a lot of these ideas, like these Egyptian hieratic art ideas, along with alchemy proper, because he was an alchemist. He was doing things like, you know, mixing sacred paints and doing alchemical
Hmm.
processes and doing like explaining how to do these like sacred rituals that would be the final step to imbuing these sacred sites with the telestic energy through like the opening of the mouth ceremony with an idol or something like that. But what he says, one of what I think must be one of the key lost pieces to this wisdom, because you see this idea across cultures too, is some sort of basic, sort of almost spiritual vital energy. Like the Greeks called it pneuma, the
Hmm.
Indians called it prana.
Yep.
And and he says right in his writings, like to do the alchemical processes, you need to essentially, you know, cook whatever you're cooking until it releases its pneuma. Then you need to like somehow structure the pneuma and put it back into a more perfected telestic form. And that's how you eventually end up with something sacred, like a philosopher's stone, like a sacred statue. Um, and we're not even remotely thinking about that when we make things these days, like this idea that there could be some sort of, you know, sacred property, sacred ethereal property that we're releasing from things, and then that's the sort of crowning achievement, or at least a core part of what we need to do before we make an object or a temple or a statue or a whatever.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, maybe that's just mythology, but again, it seems too coincidental for me that you have all of these sacred cultures coming to this conclusion that there is some kind of vital energy that is in the body, that's in the cosmos as well. That's another part of it, is like these
Hmm.
divine pneumas. There's planetary pneumas. There's all these different pneumas, and that's what also constructs. We mentioned subtle bodies in chakras before. There are Greek corollaries to these subtle bodies that you often hear about in an Eastern context. There's the okima pneuma.
Hmm.
It's a vehicle for your pneuma that can then, you know, there's all these ancient Greek, they call these yatromontes, these philosopher sages that would like go into caves and they would like astral project their okima pneumas, stuff like that. I'm taking the conversation into too many different directions now, but I do think
Well, no,
this
I'm
idea
with you though.
of
I'm
a
with you.
vital
Yeah.
I do think this idea of a vital energy
Yeah.
could be core to this conversation, because maybe that could be the missing piece that makes some of these lost technologies possible.
And Michael, I think you are right on the money with that.
Mm,
Now, you mentioned these names. I think in the Hebrew Kabbalah, it was referred to as the Ruach.
yeah.
Um, what else? Mana in
Yeah.
Polynesian, same thing. Karl von Reichenbach, I believe, who studied in the late 19th century, referred to what he believed this subtle life force or energy was. He called it the odic force. Um,
Hmm.
what else? The key,
There's the what's the thing the Germans were obsessed with, the vril, how
yeah,
do you
the
say that?
vril,
Yeah.
yeah, the vril. In alchemy, I think that the term that applies to this is the spiritus mundi
Yeah, in
in alchemy.
Latin, yeah.
Yeah, the spiritus mundi. There were, yeah, many names for it. Wilhelm Reich.
Yes,
I think he was looking at
orgone
that.
energy.
Yes. So I think that it's a real thing. It's not just now, maybe in 19th century physics, it was referred to as ether. And I think in those early tests trying to establish whether the ether was real or not, and I'm not an expert on this, but
Yeah.
what strikes me is that perhaps where that failed in demonstrating the existence of the ether was it was assumed that the ether was a fixed medium.
Yeah. Right.
If it was a moving medium, a dynamic medium, it comes into a whole different realm. And I think that perhaps now we're on the verge of being able to scientifically influence. I mean, the yogis have been doing it all along, controlling the ruach, controlling the bioenergy in the body, the vril, whatever we want to
Prana.
call it,
Yeah.
the prana, right? The prana is that subtle energy that forms like the next higher dimension of our the vehicles of our consciousness, right? So can we actually develop those subtle bodies to the point where we can actually become aware of them, exist within them, um, uh, transfer our consciousness to the subtler material that forms our physical body that undoubtedly is vibrating at a higher rate than the physical aspect, right?
Hmm.
And maybe what senescence and eventual debility as we age is that the vibratory frequencies between the physical and the subtle and the spiritual are getting out of sync.
Yeah.
And as long as they're in sync, right, the life force can move dynamically. And that's what Reich found in his therapy, that he had to unblock the movement, the rhythmical movement of the orgone energy field, the biofield within the human body. What if the ancients had a similar system where they knew how to stimulate and influence the biofield, the bioenergy, the prana of the earth? And I think if speculations along those lines might be very fruitful, because I
Yeah.
think that's where we're going with this thing. And if you can harmonize the vibratory frequencies, let's say, of an individual entity like a human with the vibratory energies of the earth, and in turn synchronize those harmoniously with a higher cosmic cycle of vibrations, now I think that's what
Yeah.
the ancients were up to. Something
Man.
along those lines.
Yeah. And this has become very more real for me, like less just like of an intellectual, jerk off, and more of a like this is actually like something that you can experience as an individual. Um I about 10 months ago went to Monroe Institute, did a gateway process retreat.
Mm-hmm.
I was getting into very deep states of meditation, using these binaural beat frequencies they were using.
Mm-hmm.
I and I was feeling these like subtle energies they would say that you would feel, but I wasn't coming anywhere close to like really having a full blown out of body experience. But on the
Yeah.
last day, I won't tell the whole story because I've told it so many times. But on the last day of the retreat, Randall, I fucking had a full blown OBE, one and only time I've had it in my life. It was so hyper real and so visceral and so
Wow.
terrifying that it was like just as real as anything I've ever experienced in my life. And it's one of those things that's so ontologically recontextualizing because there's just almost nothing you can say except, okay, that's a thing. That really
Yeah.
is a thing. I
Really.
didn't do it because I'm some great meditator. It's I stumbled into it. I put myself in the place where I hit the jackpot or slipped on the banana peel or whatever, and it happened. And once that kind of thing happens, there are so
Mm.
many downstream questions, but it does make this idea of a vital energy, a spiritual energy body, like pneuma, whatever you want to call it,
Mm-hmm.
so much more real, you know?
Yes.
Like, yeah,
Yes. Well, that's interesting. Did you by any chance happen to meet Sean Webb or
I
Bradley
did.
Young?
Yeah, I had Sean Webb on the show recently.
Oh,
Yeah,
you
he's the
had
one.
Sean on the show.
He
Okay.
connected us. Remember?
I did?
No, no. Sean Sean reconnected you and me.
Oh, that's how you
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I met.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Well,
Or
I'll have to
remet. Yeah.
yeah, I'll have to thank Sean for that or
Yes.
curse him. I don't know which, but no, I will. So that's interesting. Okay, that's I like Sean. We've traveled together, and when you travel with somebody for a week, couple of weeks, you get to know them pretty good.
Yeah.
And I spent, not 2 weeks, week and a half on the road with Sean, and I still liked him at the end of it. So
That's a good
that's
accomplishment.
a good sign.
One thing I do want to spend some time on is some speculation about this breakaway civilization, because it is, it's such a fun clickbaity topic, but I also do really think that it's one of the more parsimonious possibilities when you start asking questions about, like, what could, this UFO phenomenon be? What could, like, these strange craft that we see be related to? And it seems like that to me, or that along with a couple other possibilities, seems much more likely to me than the standard, like, alien came from a super vast distance away,
Yes.
got in a ship and went doo 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 and somehow found the Earth, right?
Yes.
Of
Yeah.
course, sure, that's possible. Maybe it's multiple things. I'm totally open to many possibilities. But to me, the idea that it is something here already, ultra terrestrial, meta terrestrial, breakaway civilization, that makes way more sense to me. And I think
Mhm.
it fits into your theory. But how do you conceive of whatever they are? Do you conceive of them as super advanced humans? Do you conceive of them as some cohabitating species that maybe we're related to but are different? Are these like hermetic adepts, like of like a Manly P. Hall or Theosophy sort of like strain, Atlanteans? What, all of the above? What do you think, man?
Wow. Okay. Well, all right. We'll have that's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get down to fundamentals. Let's start with the ground beneath our feet. Okay, we inhabit a planet that has been sculpted by outside forces on a scale and to a degree that we've scarcely even imagined up to this point, right? The story writ large into our planet that we inhabit is one of very much like the metaphor that's been used for war that soldiers have used is long periods of excruciating boredom, punctuated by short periods of absolute terror, right? And that model kind of applies to Earth history. We were talking earlier about, the long-term measure of time when we went from a 7,000-year model of Earth history to hundreds of millions and now billions of years of Earth history, right? Well, in that transition, a couple of things I think happened. One is that we kind of have come to realize now that our species is much older than we'd previously
Mhm.
imagined. Just like once upon a time, we imagined a young Earth and then find out that there's evidence for a much, much older Earth. I think we were kind of laboring under the conception of a very young species, that we showed up on the stage of evolution only very recently. And tantalizing evidence keeps accruing that suggests we're a much older
Yeah.
species than we had previously imagined. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if we take, and it's not so wild to speculate because we're finding, paleoanthropologists have found bits of skeleton and bone that, when reconstructing, looks like, well, the being would that we would reconstruct pretty much looks like a modern human being. Same size cranial capacity, upright posture, you know,
Opposable thumbs.
opposable thumbs. Thank you, etc. We could go down the list, and it looks like we were around. I say we meaning Homo sapiens sapiens around 150,000 years ago, and that's now a relatively conservative number.
Yeah.
There's tantalizing evidence to suggest 200,000 years.
That's
Well,
crazy.
if you figure 200,000 years and a generation is, let's say, 25 years, that's 7,000 generations of people. Now, let's look at what we moderns have accomplished since the scientific enlightenment, followed by the industrial revolution, compared to where our civilization is now compared to where it was 300 years ago.
You know what I just thought of, to interject with really quick,
Yeah.
is you know how each yuga is how there's like a scale, and this is a Greek concept too, that there's sort of like golden ages to bronze ages.
Hmm.
If we
Yeah.
speculated, if we went back to roughly that time period that you just indicated and looked at whatever yuga that would correspond to and the
Hmm.
kind of things they said were, because basically for people not familiar with this, you're closer and further from divinity according to these yuga cycles. And like if you're in
Hmm.
a golden age cycle, you're very close to divinity. If you're in our, I think we're in like a bronze cycle now,
In the Greek age, we'd be in the Iron Age, I believe,
okay, yeah. I don't remember what I don't remember
which
what
is
the
the lowest
yeah,
vibratory
yeah.
cycle, if you want to look at it that way.
So if that would be a fun thought experiment, just to look back at, like these early human ancestors, maybe they were in some yuga where the pneumatic weather was more conducive or whatever to being in contact with higher intelligence. And that would be consistent with where these technologies, these like high sacred technologies would be coming from, maybe.
Well, ultimately, I think that the higher sacred science is coming out of our own consciousness,
Yeah.
but it's externalizing. And what we have done is we have desacralized
Yes.
the mundane, whereas for our ancestors, our predecessors, ancient peoples, the mundane and the divine were not two distinct things. They were
Right.
just different points on a continuum. And
Totally.
the idea, I think, was that if we create a civilization that reflects the patterns and tempos and rhythms and proportions of the heavens, the greater cosmos, the cosmic matrix out of which our being emerged, both, uh, you know, intellectually, conceptually, physically, that we're ultimately a product of those processes. You
Yeah.
mentioned earlier, or talking about, evolution, um, the Darwinian model of of evolution was based on very similar to the gradualist model of geology.
Right.
Whereas in geology, it was one grain of sand, one drop of water at a time, an almost completely indiscernible process. In Darwinian evolution, it's the counterpart in that the changes from between individuals that make up the endpoints of this continuum of evolutionary change are so small and so incremental that they're not even noticeable from one generation to the next. It has to accumulate over presumably hundreds, if not thousands, of generations, right? So gradualism in geology and Darwinian evolution in biology rose up together and sort of complemented each other.
Right.
And what was thrown out was the idea of cycles, right? Because now it's just a long, uniform process from less complexity to greater complexity. I know that's an simplification, but that's basically what it was.
Hmm.
And the model of life on Earth was very similar, that you had an ascending curve,
Yeah.
like a logarithmic curve. Same way with civilization, from barbarism to modern civilization. But I think what we really began to realize by the late 70s and into the 80s is that the model of change, organic change, life on Earth, was not a smooth curve, but it was really more like a sawtooth. And that there were episodes where species would proliferate, the world would become densely inhabited with multiple species, and then an event node would occur. And above that event node, there was a very drastic and discernible diminishment in the number of species. Then, after some hiatus, some long period of time, or maybe not so long, there would be this rapid proliferation of species. We call it rapid speciation, right? And then the number of species would sort of repopulate, stabilize somewhat, but continue to increase until the next drop off, right? So we see that sawtooth curve. First, there was a Precambrian like explosion. You've heard of the Cambrian explosion. Then that was followed by the what they call the five great mass extinction episodes. And then in between the five great ones, I think the earliest one was uh, probably the late Ordovician. Let me see if I can remember it. The late Ordovician, the Permian Triassic, There was one in the late Devonian. There was one at the Triassic, Jurassic. Then, of course, the most famous was the Cretaceous Tertiary when the dinosaurs disappeared. But now, each one of those is defined where a majority of all species on Earth suddenly disappear and they're
Mm-hmm.
gone. The fossil record, which is prolific and densely populated, suddenly just becomes sparse with only a few species. Then, after this hiatus, something happens. There's a threshold that's crossed. Species begin to rapidly expand and evolve until the next catastrophe. I think that same similar model applies to the rise and fall of human civilizations.
Yeah.
Now,
Wow.
obviously, nothing within the time span that humans have been here could match the severity of the KT boundary, the dinosaur extinction, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. But the thing of it is that the smaller the catastrophe, the more frequent they're going to be. The larger the catastrophe, the less frequent they're going to be.
Sure.
Now, within that Great Five, there are many, too many to count at this point, smaller catastrophes, which don't necessarily cause a big, very easily detectable imprint of mass extinction, but they certainly might cause a local or regional extinction, but would also be severe enough to essentially cause an extinction of an advanced civilization.
Yeah.
Not extinction of the human species, but extinction of a human civilization, which brings us to a theme that I'm very moving towards right now in terms of the long-term translation of this knowledge to where do we go from here? We're here 2025. Where do we go from here? And one of the things that I think we have to recognize is that, yeah, there are catastrophes in our future that will be entirely natural, just as they have been too many times to account in the past, and an event that barely leaves a fingerprint in the fossil record could put us back into the Stone Age.
Yeah.
And you think about how dependent we are now on integrated systems.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're up in Michigan. I'm down here in Georgia. We're talking. Everything
Milwaukee.
is now.
Milwaukee.
And what?
Milwaukee. Not
Milwaukee.
Michigan.
What did
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
say?
You said Michigan.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I
It's okay.
profoundly sorry. I apologize from the. I will not do that again. I don't know. I know Milwaukee is Wisconsin. Not to remember Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Wisconsin cheese, which brings
Yeah.
us to one of the deep philosophical and ontological questions of my existence is this: is life without cheese worth living?
We
Being
need
in
we need a
Wisconsin.
vegan. We need a vegan involved in this conversation to even really be able to cover the bases.
Of that, yeah. Okay, so I'm sorry I got distracted by cheese momentarily. Which,
Relatable.
if we wanted to just do free association here, we would jump from cheese to the moon. But I'm not
Well,
going to do that.
that's actually a tantalizing option for many reasons, but
I think we'd better save that for our next conversation,
oh
Michael.
man.
Because look, what time is it? Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to go. I mean, as much fun as I'm having, I wish I didn't have to tear myself away, but I am going to have to tear myself away in about 20 minutes, I think.
Okay. Okay.
Well,
Well, one
but
thing I
let's
do.
get back
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you can take this however you want, but I mean, your point to me is well taken that humanity is much longer than most people understand or think. There's the Silurian hypothesis that
Yeah.
there may have been other advanced civilizations a long time ago. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
these antediluvian super ancient civilizations could be related to this breakaway civilization hypothesis. Why not? Um, and if you want to continue on that note, by all means.
Yes, I do.
But I also would love to talk to you about Timaeus, Atlantis, all of that stuff too before we wrap up, if we can at least touch on it.
We can touch on it. And,
Okay.
and that would be a good conversation because we could easily devote a whole 2 hours to the
Totally.
subject of
Yeah.
Atlantis.
And plus you're about to go to the Azores too. So there's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, I just got my passport came, what was it, on Wednesday? No, this is Friday. My passport showed up in the mail. My passport renewal showed up. Let's go back to this idea of cyclical change, pulses of change, that there are periods within the continuum that change accelerates by perhaps orders of magnitude, And when that happens, if the life or the civilization that is resilient, that is adaptable, might survive. Same with the species. If it's not resilient, if it cannot adapt to rapidly accelerated changes, it won't survive. Now, within the framework of the late Quaternary, which let's say is the 200,000 years that we're speculating we moderns have been here, there have been some serious, serious catastrophic changes in the history of this planet. Now, the question in my mind becomes is how did our ancestors adapt to the point where they survived? For example, we know that there have been many, many species that didn't survive these changes, and that the greatest concentration and pulse of these changes seem to have occurred actually not long before the beginning of history as we know it. If we go back 5,000 years and say, okay, we're talking about the beginning of writing in Sumer, and that's the beginning of history. Well, if we double that, we're sitting right at the end of the Great Ice Age, right? We go just a little bit further than that, and we're in a world where sea levels are 400 feet lower. There's, more than half of North America is buried under an ice sheet bigger than the one that now covers the South Pole.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do you account for that? You don't. It's very difficult. So my wife just stuck her head in and then realized we're on a podcast. So I could have invited her in to say hello, but I didn't want to put her on the spot.
Yeah, I would like to hear her thoughts on pneumatically powered UFOs and
Sure.
such. But
Well, she's a smart lady, and but anyways, where was I? If we go back 200,000 years, there have been some very extreme changes that have affected this planet, and it seemed that they culminated in a period that lasted roughly 3,000 years at the end of the last ice age, when you had this massive proliferation of megafauna around the world, right? And as part of trying to reconstruct in our minds what this ancient world looked like, I was talking about sea levels 400 feet lower. Well, what does that do? I mean, if you look at a bathymetric map, that's a map of the seafloor, right, under the oceans, and you see that all the continents of the earth are rimmed by shallow continental shelves, right? Well, a lot of those continental shelves are below 400 feet. Some of them are above 400 feet. Right now, where the coastline is, you can picture if you drop sea level, as the level of the sea goes down, the coastline migrates seaward. When sea level rises, the coastlines migrate landward, right? Now, if we go back into the Ice Age and you start building these gigantic, enormous glacial complexes over large swaths of the Earth's surface, well, that ice is ultimately frozen ocean water. The water is evaporated out of the ocean. It becomes part of the hydrological cycle. It precipitates out, and over northern latitudes, it accumulates, but doesn't, like if you go up into Canada now, where glaciers were 1.5 miles thick, yeah, it snows a lot during the winter, but what happens in the spring and summer? The snow melts away. And then the next fall, late fall, you start accumulating snowfall. But imagine now in the onset of an ice age, winter comes on, you get a layer of snow, and then spring doesn't come for another 15,000 years. And it literally looks like the transition from an interglacial to a glacial age can happen in less than a decade, maybe even less than 5 years. And we don't know what's triggering change on that scale, right? But it appears to be real, that the changes can be that fast. Now, you don't get 6 million cubic miles of glacial ice in 5 years. It now takes thousands of years. But the change that suddenly imposes this whole new climatic regime on the planet, where for the northern latitudes, winter doesn't end for 15,000 years, that can happen like that.
Yeah.
And we don't know what's driving that. That's why I get really annoyed when people start saying that, climate change is all worked out. There's a consensus. We know there's a scientific consensus. We know no, there's not. We know a lot about it, but there's some big chunks of things we don't know.
Right.
We don't know what's driving the Earth into and out of a glacial age. But at the end of the last glacial age, the changes out of the glacial age, in a geological sense, were instantaneous.
Yeah.
And at the end of these changes, half of the great megafaunal species of planet succumbed. We survived, apparently because we had the resilience and the adaptability to survive. But these 50% of the great megafaunal species didn't. Put that into context. Think about every large animal, megafaunal essentially defined as 44 kilograms, which is about 100 pounds in body weight. So imagine that we take a census of all the animals in the world, all the animals in the world today that are more than 100 pounds in body weight. Look at North America. Name some. Well, moose, bear. We got black bear, grizzly bear. We got antelope. We've got bighorn sheep. We've got mountain lion. We could go down the list, right? And there's a certain number of them. Well, if we go back 15,000 years ago to 20,000 years ago, we had 4 species of proboscideans in North America. In other words, long-nosed animals, elephants, essentially. But mastodons, we had imperial mammoths, Columbian mammoths, woolly mammoths, right? We had lions the size of horses. We had beavers that weighed 500 and 600 pounds. We had
crazy
ground sloths that were ambling around that were as big as modern day elephants. I mean, the list could go on. There was huge camels, horses in North America, right? In fact, the bestiary of North America, it's been said that the closest modern analog to the density of North American megafaunal species in today's world would be the Serengeti Plain of Africa, right? Well, 3/4 of North America's and 3/4 of South America's megafaunal species did not survive those changes that occurred at the end of the last ice age.
Yeah.
We know that there was cultural discontinuity. It looks like the Clovis culture in North America that left fingerprints all over the unglaciated part of the continent disappeared pretty much simultaneous with the megafauna. So what happened? Well, we're piecing it together. It looks to me the evidence is increasingly pointing to some type of a cosmic event. If it was a cosmic impact. Now, this brings us into a whole other realm.
Sure, yeah.
Where I believe the ancients were aware of the fact that things that happened out there on the cosmic scale definitely translated to changes down here on the terrestrial scale. And that if they knew about those changes, those rhythms, they could adapt to them. Just like, imagine here's a sort of a metaphor that I use. Imagine that you've got a village of people, and somebody came in with a big, like the guys on the Men in Black, right? And you've got this thing, and you flash it. Everybody's memories is erased, right? And let's say it's April, weather's getting warm, right? Winter's over. Boom, the Man in Black shows up, does that flash. All their memories are erased, and so they forget that there had been winter, right? And so now as they go forward, they're thinking, this is it. This is the way things are. Nice and warm, everything's growing, a long days, short nights, etc. And you think this is the way it always is, and you have no concept of winter, that the temperature is going to get cold, what it means when things freeze, when the snow falls on the ground, right?
Yeah.
And so you go merrily on your way.
Game of Thrones type winter.
And what?
Game of Thrones type winter. Like a destructive, long,
Yeah, the Thimble winter, right? So, okay, but now imagine that for whatever reason, there's a small group of people who their memory erasure doesn't take, and they remember, and they go, okay, let me try to explain to you winter, snow. Let me explain to you what snow is. Let me try to explain. And these people have no concept because all they've known is the warmth of late spring and summer. And so they can look at you one of two ways. Either you are just an eccentric that can be ignored, or you are a crazy person, and let's lock that crazy person up so we don't have to have our equanimity bothered by all these talks about, hey, this isn't going to last forever. It's going to change. And when it does, if you ain't ready for it, you're not going to survive, right? Or, third option, these people are prophets. Well, I think that's what essentially identified prophecy in the past was the ability to discern the larger picture of things.
Yeah.
Now, if you listen to those prophets and they say, okay, things are gonna start drastically changing, uh, in about 2 moons or 3 moons, things are gonna shift. And all the lakes here where you're fishing, they're gonna freeze over and turn to ice. Uh, Nothing will grow for 3 or 4 months, whatever. So you need to adapt. You need to get food in for the winter because if you don't, you won't be alive in the spring. You'll have starved to death or frozen to death, whatever. So I think we can translate that concept to a larger scale. And I think that's one component of what the ancient peoples were up to was being able to track the changes in the heavens because ultimately I think it's the heavens and the changes out there in the bigger exo environment that are translating to changes down here in the terrestrial, the world down here below.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think that it's governing the changes in the geomagnetic field. It's related to seismicity. It's related to volcanicity, all of which have secondary and tertiary consequences. Um, Changes in the weather. I think that changes in the large scale on the galactic level can be sort of stepped down uh, into the level of a single star even. And our sun is a single star. And I think that things that happen on the galactic level can affect our sun. And we
Sure.
know now our sun is a whole lot more active than anybody was imagining 30 years ago, 40 years
Yeah.
ago. We had the solar constant, right? Well, so then when models of climate change started being developed, really on a serious level in the 90s, programmed into those was the solar constant, which essentially meant that if the sun is not variable, we can just ignore it in our equations, and that's what they did.
Mm.
Now, since then, we've got 35 years of accumulated observations of the sun from solar observing satellites. We also know a whole lot more about stars in our near stellar neighborhood. And what we see here, I mean, what we're pointing to is, yeah, over the long term, our sun might be much, much more variable than we'd previously imagined. On top of that, now we also see there seems to be a connection between solar activity and the infall of sun grazing comets. The Kreutz sun grazers are a subclass of comets that are probably the result of the disintegration of really large comets that have been
Mm.
introduced to the inner solar system, ultimately from the reservoir of the Kuiper
Yeah.
disk, because the Kuiper disk is parallel and close to the plane of the ecliptic. Well, what we're seeing, and next time I'll have it set up where we look at it. There are some video clips now of comets hitting the sun, and instantly followed by massive coronal mass ejections,
Yeah.
right? Which then goes out into the heliosphere that can affect things all on multiple levels. So I guess what I'm getting at here is that I think we can learn a great deal and extract a great deal of information from ancient history.
Yeah.
And ancient history has come down to us not just in the artifacts and the debitage that we dig up from the ground, but in the traditions, the mythology, the legends, the folklore, the remnants of a civilization. Now, to bring it back to the discussion about megaliths and sacred spots, what it's looking like is that if you've got 200,000 years of history, and within that 200,000 years of history, you've got a number of major global catastrophes, which we know happen. Okay, so now if a civilization is resilient and is adaptable, Plato discusses this very explicitly in
Yeah.
Timaeus, where he talks about the myth of fate and there being a
Yes.
periodicity of catastrophes.
Yeah.
And he says, that in certain kind of catastrophes involving fire, those living near the ocean are probably going to be more
Oh,
likely to
right.
survive. Those, in world destructions of floods, those in the mountains are going to be more likely to survive. But in either case, it ultimately comes down to the resilience and the adaptability. And what is
And
happening, I think, is our focus has gotten so concerned with the trivial and the day to day to the ignorance, ignoring the larger cycles and rhythms that our ancestors were so in touch with, that we're so adapted to. And we need to get back to that. We need to get back to, we've gotten insulated from nature to the point that we can live our lives. Now, people can live their whole lives and never see the Milky Way galaxy, never go out and be able to
Yeah.
find Polaris, the North Star, or the rising of Sirius, the Dog Star, or the Pleiades, any of that. Well, that was imbued into consciousness of ancient peoples. And
Yeah.
one of my goals is to bring that back. Interestingly, I've gotten with a small group of trusted individuals that I've worked with for years, and we're coming together to pool our resources to actually try to create, and we are doing this. We're actually actively looking at properties right now as we speak, um, where we can do an experimental prototype where we bring these principles of geomantic engineering and say or cosmic orientation and using sacred geometry to try to recapture the system. And
So
yeah,
cool.
I think we're going to pull this off. I think it's going to start really getting underway within the next year. I've created a nonprofit institution that is the subheading that allows you to establish schools. So I'm going to call its function a school, because ultimately, in the Pythagorean sense,
Yeah.
to where people can come and actually
Okay.
firsthand
Not
experience.
academy in the
Well,
spirit of Plato.
yeah. Well, yes, elements of the Pythagorean school, the Platonic Academy, the Druidic groves where
Mm,
wisdom was imparted. You know, bring in all of those influences that we have access to now because we are an emerging global civilization,
yeah.
right? And understand these larger cycles, because I think it's in the understanding of these larger cycles that we can create a civilization that is truly sustainable over a
Hmm.
long term. But if we ignore, like the Hopis said, the destruction comes, the cataclysm comes when people forget the plan of the Creator. And for
Right.
me, the plan of the Creator is the divine matrix upon which all time and space is framed.
Yeah.
And if we create a civilization that resonates in harmony with that, it maximizes the probability that we can endure for thousands of years and not just 2 or 3 centuries and see the next catastrophe throw us right back into the Stone Age.
Yeah. Well
And
said,
so,
man. Yeah.
yeah.
And there's
So,
there's a lament of Hermes too that says the same thing about, there will come, and Graham has that reading of it on YouTube that has a ton of views, but it's like Hermes is giving this speech essentially, I think, to Asclepius, saying,
yes,
there'll come a day where everybody forgets about the gods, and like no one believes in anything sacred anymore. And
right.
yeah, there's that similar idea too of like the Maitreya Buddha will come when no one knows the wisdom of Buddhism anymore. Like there's so
Yeah.
many second coming of Christ, like very like a lot of similar ideas.
Oh, there's so much we could talk about
Yeah.
and unpack here along these themes, and it's worth doing. I mean, look,
Yeah.
uh, it's kind the kinds of conversations that need to become routine again. Um, and I'm very much focused on, because so early we started this conversation about my rural upbringing, and not only was it the rhythms of nature, and not only seeing the landscapes around me, it was also the fact that from I can remember some of my earliest memories, 5 and 6 years old. I'm outside agape
Yeah.
at the heavens,
Right.
and learned probably by the time I was 6 or 7 years old, I could go out and I could find the North Star. Okay, so now I knew my cardinal directions. As sometimes we do these projects, and this is kind of an aside, but it kind of underscores what I think is perhaps part of the problem, the disengagement with the larger realms of our
Yeah.
life, is that, like, somebody will call me, yeah, we want to build a new master bedroom suite on our house. Okay, good. Well, let's talk a little bit about your house. Is it a sloped lot? Is it a flat lot? Which way is the your property oriented? And I'll have people, like, I'll say, what do you mean orient? Well, I mean, which way does it face? Like, when you walk out your front door, what direction are you facing? And then I'll have people tell me, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, how is this even possible? How
Yeah.
I can go back and can say, I remember the house we moved into when I was 4 years old. When I walked out the front door, I was facing west. I remember that from 70 years ago. 70
Right.
years ago, I can remember I lived in a house and I walked out that front door. I was facing west. So from
Yeah.
that early of an age, I was, I was immersed into that realm of things. Now there are kids who have no idea of the cardinal directions, much
Right.
less the ordinal directions. They've never seen. I know college age kids that I've talked to have never really seen the Milky Way. Well, we know now that kids that are raised closer to nature, in a rural environment, they have their brain is structured, literally is structured different than young people who have not been exposed to the green of the woods, the blue of the sky, the stars at night, who've not been exposed to that. Literally measurable structural differences between the two
Wow.
brains. The brain, and we could get into that, save it for another, because I can show you actually some of the brain scans. You can
Yeah.
see, here's the kids that grew up closer to nature. Here's the kids that never knew anything but an urban environment.
Wow.
In that realm, what do you have? You see that the levels of depression are greater, the levels of divorce, the levels of drug addiction, the levels of suicide, etc., are all higher
Wow.
in the young people that have not had that regular exposure to nature. We need to correct that. We need to shift that trajectory, create ways to bring not just young people, old people, people of all age back into connection with those greater rhythms.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's happening. That's happening. And I think I'm going to have to go in a minute, but
Yeah.
we'll leave it at this. I think we're at a stage now where we are literally discovering what the ancient technology was. And here I think we're going to leave it. When we were talking earlier about the prana, the ki, the chi, the ruach,
Yes.
the,
Yes.
the orgone, the bioenergy, I think now what we're standing on the threshold is understanding that transition between the material realm and the spiritual realm. And that is in the realm of plasma physics, the
Oh
fourth
man.
state of
Oh,
matter.
you're tantalizing me so much because I just started reading The New Science of Heaven.
Yes.
I read this book, kind of an obscure book, but actually Wilhelm Reich features heavily in this book, and it's called Cosmic Pulse of Life. Have you heard of this book?
Yes, I'm sure, quite sure I have it. The
Yeah,
author is, give me the
Constable.
first name.
It's Trevor James Constable.
Trevor
Is it-
James Constable. Yes,
Yeah,
yes. I
yeah.
actually have several of his books. Yeah,
Cool,
read him
cool.
years ago.
Yeah, yeah, I just got turned on to it by this really interesting guy named Adam Curry. But yeah, and
Hmm.
last
I
thing
know
I'll
who he
say.
is.
Oh, you do? Yeah, awesome,
Well,
awesome.
yeah, yeah. I mean, he does podcast with his partner. They talk about a lot about current events, kind of through a humorous
Oh
lens. Is
no, no,
that
different
Adam?
Adam Curry, different Adam Curry. This guy's
Oh, okay.
he's about my age. He's actually a psi researcher. He worked for Princeton Engineering and the Pear Lab where they do like psi research and
Got it.
he very interesting dude. But anyway, yeah, what I wanted to say too is like you find this in all of the esoteric traditions too, man. Is like you don't do a ritual without a book of hours. You need to
Sure.
know what
Yeah.
energies, what spirits, what
Yep.
divinities are active
Yep.
when. You don't do an alchemical process. I have a
Yep.
friend, really awesome friend,
Yeah.
named MJ Dorian, who decided he wanted to do a real alchemical experiment and do a podcast about the history of alchemy and such. And he's like, man, I didn't understand how in tune with nature I needed to be to do this. Like, you can't do certain things unless it's a
Yeah.
certain moon cycle or a certain.
Exactly.
And it's like
Exactly.
to us, it's like, oh, is this superstition? That what is this? And it's like, I don't think so, man. I think we're just so out of touch with the way these people
Yes.
thought and what they were in touch
Yes.
with that to us it just doesn't. We're illiterate. But yeah, yeah, man. I'm so excited. I would love to do this again sooner than later, honestly, if you're up for it. But I know you got
Sure.
to go.
Well, we
Yeah,
conclude with this. I'll just do like a 2 minute
yeah,
to bring a final perspective. We're talking about all of the sacred sites around the world. And one of the patterns we find repetitively over and over again is that the modern incarnation, whether it's at Stonehenge, Chartres Cathedral, it doesn't matter. We could list 100 of them. Before Chartres Cathedral, that was a sacred site.
hmm,
Going back to the Druid period, probably long before the Druids came and disappeared, it was a recognized site of sanctity, which in my mind suggests that there is some quality
yeah,
about these sacred sites. One thing that's consistent over and over and over again that we find is the presence of water, quite often
Yeah.
in the form of springs, oftentimes in the crossing of fault lines in the bedrock through which water is moving. For example, our crossing lines, fault lines crossing under the altar area of Stonehenge, right? The depth to the water table below the paving stones of the floor. Like if you go into Chart and you're standing on that great labyrinth there, there's a couple of things. If you were to actually hinge the front wall, that western wall of the Chart Cathedral, where you enter into that doorway, if you hinge it at the sill and you fold it down, the great rose window juxtaposes on the labyrinth.
Mm.
Now, the great rose window is the zodiac. It represents the heavens,
Ah.
the celestial realm. Now you have this labyrinthine pathway juxtaposed on it. Okay, that has interesting implications. Now, if you're standing at the center of that labyrinth, the water table below your feet happens to be the same distance as the apex of the ogival vault above your head. I don't think that's coincidental.
No.
I think that the design of Chartres Cathedral is a sophisticated way of harnessing, if you will, of amplifying the natural energies that manifest in the landscape through the movement of water. And the movement of that water is in turn being affected by the movements of the heavens. Something, though, has disrupted this process in the form of catastrophes. And we'll leave it at this. I think that what we're approaching is a model where once upon a time, maybe it could have even been, I'm willing to speculate and go back 100 to 120,000 years. And there are reasons for that, good reasons for going back that far. But for now, let's just not be too timid to put out an outrageous hypothesis. And that is that there once was a global civilization. Somehow, or maybe even more than one global civilization, because look how quickly we've created and built our
Mhm.
global
Mhm.
civilization in 300 to 400 years.
Yeah.
And how easily could 300 or 400 years get lost in the noise of 200,000 years of
Yeah.
change, right? So there should be no restriction on our ability to speculate and say maybe there were even more than one advanced civilization. But there were also catastrophes, global catastrophes. The catastrophe that wiped out the megafauna certainly would have wiped out most civilizations. If the Younger Dryas events happened again today, yeah, we'd be picking up the pieces in the aftermath and starting over again, right? And we would probably be looking at 90% of the global population disappearing, right? So now here's the thing, we were talking about a breakaway civilization, right? When I see all of these ancient structures occurring between, let's say, let's say in the Neolithic, which would be the period 4 to 5,000 years ago, there was a
Mhm.
wave of sacred building in
Yeah.
multiple places around here. We find it in the Tigris Euphrates Valley. We find it in the Indus Valley. We find it in Egypt. It's in North America. It's in South America. Within about a 2 to 3 century span, you have these amazing building campaigns going on around. Well, if you go back 2,000, 3,000 years earlier than that, you couldn't have done that for the simple reason there weren't not enough people to perform the labor and then to create a society in which there was enough leisure time and you had people growing food, providing shelter, providing clothes, so you could have an army of workers that could actually be constructing these
Mhm.
vast complexes, whether it's right. And what we see is that it's not a continuum. Again, it's like there are pulses where all of a sudden, for a couple of centuries, there's an enormous amount of activity, and then it kind of quiets down for a period of time. And then there's another pulse where there's a lot of activity, right? So I think what we're getting at here is that if we want to use a metaphor, let's call it a sacred machine.
Mm.
And we'll speculate that once upon a time, there was a civilization that could have arisen using sources of energy, tapping into sources of energy which we've forgotten about. Fossil fuels is not the only basis for building a civilization,
No.
okay? Now, for whatever means and however something happened, there was a catastrophe. Civilization is essentially, and when you understand the degree and scale of these global changes, you understand that Oh, well, if a younger Dryas was to happen again today, well, 10,000 years from now, archaeologists would be hard pressed to find any evidence that we were even here. And that's essentially a fact,
Yeah.
right? So understanding that, no, it's totally premature to just dismiss out of hand and say, oh no, it was all just barbaric Stone Age. There was no
Yeah. Yeah.
scientific understanding. There was no understanding of natural law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now, as soon as what they do that, all the experts, what they've done is they've just locked themselves into a conceptual prison. They put on a straitjacket that's blinding them from seeing the possibilities
Yeah.
of the deeper story of the human species on planet Earth, right? And I think what we see in that period between 4,000, 5,000 years ago that was so prolific around the planet is that, yeah, here's an attempt to, was not able to build the entire reconnect, reconstruct, re-engineer the machine to the scale, the planetary scale that it once was, but at least to restore enough of it that the technology, the spiritual technology, the subtle technology, the technology of plasma physics, I'll go that far, could at least on some scale be resurrected.
Wow.
And then there would be consequences, positive consequences. For one, the fertility of the land
Hmm.
around these structures is going to be enhanced. The
Interesting.
well-being of people is going to be enhanced. It's going to change the vibrations of the landscape and its resonance with the higher, right? So I think what we're looking at when we see Stonehenge and we see the pyramids and the sacred temples is the effort to resurrect or reconstruct at least some elements of the much older system,
Wow.
right? Then there were intervening catastrophes. Since the Bronze Age, there was a major Bronze Age catastrophe that seemed to have brought an end to that, right?
Yeah.
Not on the scale of the Younger Dryas, but I think we're in a unique position right now. We're coming at the end of 10,000 years of relatively relatively stable climate in the post-Ice Age era called the Holocene. And we've had this period of blessed relief from the kinds of extreme changes that were a regular part of the Ice Age era. We've been able to build this civilization with several aborted attempts, setbacks, but we're on the threshold now of being able to not only move forward using subtle, new, powerful technologies, but reach back to the depths of prehistory and learn those fundamental, critical, vital lessons that have been preserved for us from some long forgotten ancestors that knew that the day would come again when it was time to resurrect the ancient spiritual machine and bring the planet back into a higher vibrational frequency with the cosmos. And I say that time is right now. And we don't know how much time we've got to implement this ancient technology and fuse it with what we now know, because sooner or later a catastrophe will come again. But if we can develop the resilience, the adaptability, or perhaps even the knowledge to break the ancient curse and spare the earth from the next catastrophe, spare life from the trauma of these cosmic intercessions, well, maybe that's our role as an advanced civilization. So I think we'll leave it at that, and there's
Yeah.
plenty to pick up on.
Yeah. You got me. Yeah, you got me very tantalized for a part two. I can't believe we didn't talk about Atlantis. I can't believe we didn't talk about the deep underground structures in Egypt. There's so much we have. We didn't talk about these, like this emerging and possibly ancient plasma
Mm-hmm.
element of this whole thing. And I mean, man, there's more interesting stuff too, because as you know, like speaking of these like strange alternative energy sources or vital energy sciences, it
Mm-hmm.
seems like the powers that be are openly hostile toward them. Like anything having to do with like Wilhelm Reich's work was basically
Oh
destroyed.
yeah. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
like so.
He was
Yeah,
destroyed. His work
yeah.
was destroyed, but enough of it has survived that we've recovered a lot of it. And I think the key to really getting an in-depth understanding down to the details and the specifics is provided for us in unlikely vehicles that have been overlooked by the powers that be, which is
Mm.
the archaic traditions that we've inherited,
Yeah, man. Yeah.
right?
Well, it's been an absolute honor. I would love
Oh,
to do a
thank you,
part
Michael.
two sooner than later. And yeah, let's talk More.
Yeah, I enjoyed every 43,200 seconds of it. No, I don't think we went that long.